Edward King was a sort of bishop who rather liked the pomp and ceremony of the role and was famous for wearing his purple cassock all around the place, which would have been an unheard of thing for this clergyman. Anyway, the clergyman went and had a nice cup of tea with the bishop. He got back home to Pinchbeck and wrote in his diary, "The most delightful tea with the bishop, who was a terribly informal man. He greeted me in his dressing gown."
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. My name's Stuart Kelly. I'm the chief critic for Scotland on Sunday, and it's an absolute delight and pleasure to be here with Richard Coles.
Again.
Again, we have previously crossed swords in Wigtown.
We have.
For his first novel, I mean, beforehand I was cheering you about the memoirs, and since then you've written a very, I think, important and touching book about grief. Murder Before Evensong is your first novel, though. I think it's an absolute charm of a book, and we will be discussing it, we'll be hearing from it. But before that, as those of you here who have been to several events may know, we've been trying to, in some ways, mark the dreadful events that happened with Salman Rushdie. And it's not just about Rushdie, and it's not just about festivals, it's about the importance of freedom of speech universally. And we've been asking people to read a favourite quote from Rushdie. But I think today we have something really rather more special, which is a story about Rushdie.
Yes.
Never before heard to this audience.
Well, no, I don't think I've ever shared this in a public forum, and I'm glad that we're mindful of freedom of speech because there is language in it, ladies and gentlemen, which ill becomes a clergyman, but I'll tell you. So, and also, I'm sorry to say, but the whole building will be shuddering with the name drops that are about to come. Apologies for that in advance. But I was in, this is a few years ago, and I was in Los Angeles, and I was staying with Helen Fielding, the author of Bridget Jones' Diaries, who was living there at the time. And she said one day, let's go for lunch. And so we went for lunch in a Chinese restaurant in Beverly Hills. It's about the most glamorous Chinese restaurant I've ever been to. And Salman and his then wife Padma were also at that lunch. So there we were, sitting in this restaurant. We were going to be joined by somebody else, who was Carrie Fisher. So Salman Rushdie, Carrie Fisher, Helen Fielding, and me. And so we were sitting there, and Carrie was a little bit late, so we sort of started, and the waiter very kindly came and gave dishes, which, you know, those lazy Susans. So we kind of went round slowly on the lazy Susan, we helped ourselves, and then Carrie arrived with a small entourage, a little out of breath. And she said, "I'm sorry I'm late, I've been at a convention." And we said, "Oh, convention of what?" Assuming, you know, Star Wars convention. She said, "No, it was a convention of sex toys." "Do you want to see my giveaways?" And she produced this big kind of carrier bag, and from it she produced, well, all I can say is my most abiding memory of Salman Rushdie is trying to have a conversation with him while a wobbling dildo went round and round in front of us. And that is my Salman Rushdie story.
I don't think anyone could top it. Before we hear from Murder Before Evensong, the first of the Canon Clement Mysteries, I wanted to ask a bit about the fact that you've stepped down from parish ministry.
Yeah.
And this is a book very much about parishes.
Yeah.
Do you feel nostalgic for the parish?
It's not quite nostalgic. I think when I was in the parish, any of us involved in parish life feel nostalgic for the ideal parish that we perhaps fondly imagined, but of course never existed. Now I'm out of it. I retired at the end of April, just after Easter. I just miss it, actually. I mean, I miss all the obvious things, the people, the fun. I even miss the sort of challenging aspects of it. What I really miss is the way it shapes your life. It's one of those jobs that determines who you are. So you don't really have to think about why you are somewhere, what you're for, because everyone kind of knows it's a given. So you wander around the world with a dog collar on, You know, just a kind of little couple of inches of white plastic that is the most recognizable uniform anyone ever thought of. And, you know, you can walk into a hospital and people say hello. You could walk into anywhere and people, perhaps not, I don't know, spearmint rhino, but not everywhere. But, and people just sort of accept you being there. And that enables you to build these relationships with people. Once you've been a parish priest for a while, I was 12 years in Findon, you know, you've baptized the children, you've married the parents, usually in that order.
Not always.
and you've buried the grandparents, and before you know it, you're part of their life, and they're part of your life. And stepping away from that, I mean, you're warned about it. Archdeacons will say, be prepared, this is going to be... In fact, because of my partner David died, I've been seeing a bereavement therapist, and she perceptively said, it'll be another bereavement. And it is. So, and the other thing is, Stuart, I have to remember not to smile at people in my new village because I'm no longer the vicar. So I don't have to go and going, hello, how are you? And there's a perfectly good vicar. So I have to remember not to walk around in a vicarish way. It's not my job.
Just when you mention that there, before we hear from the book, is it difficult being there with another person who is the minister, priest of word and sacrament?
Oh, we had a clear exchange of credentials at the beginning. And I said to him, I'm not going to step on your toes. And my future ministry is going to be actually in prison. So I'm going to be doing some volunteer chaplaincy at Lewes Prison. And a friend of mine, he was a vicar in Keighley in West Yorkshire. And the Archbishop of York retired and said, can I come and be your assistant curate? And he was literally 23 years old and green behind the ears, and his assistant curate was the Archbishop of York. And it was tricky because actually the Archbishop had been a bishop for so long, he'd sort of, the parish ministry that he was used to was 20 years out of date. And the other guy was in charge, so it was an interesting one. So they say when you retire from parish ministry, you need a 6-month break to decompress and just to find your feet in the new world.
Let's hear a bit from the book.
Well, I shall read you a little bit. It's a vicarish bit. It's set in 1988, I have to say, so that will explain the time. Monday was meant to be Daniel's day off, but he rarely took it because he did not think of his employment, he's the vicar, as a job, or not quite. He did what needed to be done, when it needed to be done, when and where possible. And if there were nothing that needed to be done, then he would do nothing, for he thought inactivity as important as activity. Perhaps more important if Mary and Martha of Bethany in the fourth gospel were offered as an example to follow. But it was harder to justify doing nothing in a world which measured achievement more and more narrowly. And there was no credit granted to those who looked like they were idling. On the contrary, they were looked down on, or with suspicion, in a brave new world of balance sheets and productivity. Our measurements will only be as sound as the measures we use to establish them, he once said to a keen rural dean who wanted to apply the methods of business to the calculation of souls saved. He gave Daniel rather a sour look, and ever since Daniel found himself more and more tempted to the sin of dissembling a busyness he did not actually believe in. He was not the only one. He remembered once in London having nothing in his engagement book, going to the pictures in Leicester Square to a lunchtime screening of The Eagle Has Landed. He thought he was the only person there until the lights came up and he saw there was another, the Secretary of State for Energy, Mr. Benn, who looked sheepishly at him and he sheepishly back, shrugging in the manner of a guilty man offering no defense.
The part you read there included not a satirical, but certainly a sharp view about church bureaucracy.
Yes.
And how much did the church bureaucracy make you feel that actually your vocation might be towards something like prison ministry rather than parish ministry?
I think anyone who has committed their life or part thereof to a national institution would recognise the frustrations that clergy feel with the Church of England. It's in the nature of the beast that inevitably frustrations accrue, because what comes from HQ is not necessarily something that fits properly onto the circumstances in your locality. And for clergy of the Church of England in the old days, we used to have freehold. So once we were appointed to a parish, we were practically masters of all, and it was all masters in those days, of course, masters of our domains. We couldn't be gotten rid of, and we did pretty much what we wanted. And of course, parishes were scattered far and wide. Do you know that there's a lovely story about the vicar of Pinchbeck in Lincoln Diocese, which was a tiny little fenland parish up a lane. And the vicar of Pinchbeck had been there for 65 years and had never been to Lincoln, which is the cathedral city. And they had a new bishop, Edward King, who had a new view about, this was in the 19th century, and he wanted to encourage the clergy. So he resolved that he was going to invite every cleric of the diocese to come to have tea with him at the palace in Lincoln. So this invitation duly arrived with the vicar of Pinchbeck, and off he went to Lincoln, where he had never been before, in a pony and trap and then a train and so on. And he got to Lincoln. Edward King was a sort of bishop who rather liked the pomp and ceremony of the role and was famous for wearing his purple cassock all around the place, which would have been an unheard of thing for this clergyman. Anyway, the clergyman went and had a nice cup of tea with the bishop. He got back home to Pinchbeck and wrote in his diary, "The most delightful tea with the bishop, who is a terribly informal man. He greeted me in his dressing gown." So you might say that in the good old days, you were left alone. And there's some wisdom in that, I think, partly because a bishop said to me, "You must remember, Father, all institutions are demonic," which I think is true. But we were allowed to get on with what we needed to get on with, and provided you said your prayers and were reasonably diligent and weren't criminally insane, it was probably as good a life as anyone has ever lived anywhere. Different now, of course. The church is in crisis, and there's not enough money, and they're worried about numbers, and all that stuff impinges on your work as a pastor to a set of people. And you have to find a way of dealing with that, really. And sometimes, and not just that, but I mean, you know, if anyone is rash enough to be following the deliberations of the Anglican Communion at the Lambeth Conference, will be very well aware that there are issues around which we are utterly polarized, and that impinges on what we do too.
That's something I want to come back to, but in terms of this novel as a novel, when I first heard it was coming out, it was saying cozy crime.
Yes.
Now, when I read it, I thought, I don't like the phrase cozy crime anyway. It's actually quite an elegiac book, and I think it's quite a serious book about some of the issues in it. But did you set out to write cozy crime?
No.
Or did you write about something that you knew in a setting that you understood?
Well, I think cozy crime is a label that is perhaps too easily applied, because I don't think there's anything, well, there's nothing cozy about murder, would be one thing I would say. And what I was interested in, well, I'm interested you say that, because I like to deal with serious things, but with a lightness of touch where possible. I just think that's a profitable way of doing it. And also, I was kind of interested in why is cozy crime, as it's misleadingly called, popular now? Well, I was talking to, you know, the guy, I can't remember his name, but who's been republishing all the crime novels of the 1930s for the British Library. Do you know who I mean?
The old Murder Club books.
The old Murder Club books.
Yes.
And it's really interesting that there was a huge sort of rise of interest in that kind of book in the late 1930s, when, guess what? Everyone was very anxious because they could sense that the world was tipping into a difficult place. And it is tempting, perhaps, to imagine that one reason why that's appealing now is because we too sense that we are perhaps about to enter tough times, challenging times. And why is that appealing? Well, I think it offers you an orderly world that is suddenly disrupted, and then it's put back together again. And I think that speaks to a deep need of ours.
It's interesting you mentioned the golden age of crime and things like the Murder Club. When I was researching my book, The Minister and the Murderer, I read a lot of the work from that period. The strangest thing is, the priest, the minister, is never actually the villain. And it seems as if we do have a vestigial sense of respect for the role, even up to today when, as you have mentioned already, we're looking at declining roles, we're looking at declining income. Why do you think we still do have this kind of attachment to the idea of the vicar, the minister, the priest?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think it's very deeply written into our cultural memory. This idea, and I think it's to do with the confessor. I think it's someone at the heart of the community who acts as a sort of lightning rod for the anxieties that affect any community, because we are creatures who contend, and that always creates tension, and that tension needs to go somewhere. And I think one of the mechanisms in the past has been to take that to the priest, and the priest will somehow reckon that. That's one thing. Do you know how many clergy there are in crime fiction?
As protagonists or as just general?
As detectives, as sleuths.
Father Brown, although they're not really crime novels, they're Chestertonian paradoxes. There's James Runce's Grantchester books.
Sidney Chambers.
Sidney Chambers.
400.
400?
There are 400.
Well, that's 398 I've still got to read.
And I think it's partly that, this idea that this is and there's an interesting, if you are a vicar, I mean, no one particularly wants to come to church, or very few people do. They're not interested in our doctrine, they're not interested in our sermons, they're not interested in our hymns particularly anymore, but they're interested in the people who do it. I think there's something about the figure of the priest that continues to interest people, and also to offer something which perhaps others don't. And if you're looking for a detective, my older brother is a detective, a real one. He's retired now. But we often used to swap notes because we both were concerned with looking at the surface of something in which there's a tiny disruption to a pattern, perhaps, but what that tiny disruption tells you about is something much more potentially threatening or sinister that's happening deep beneath the surface. And you have to look and see what these disruptions mean and how people interact and where the likely person who might be the author of a particular deed might be. I mean, we're often swapping notes.
Ian Rankin has talked about the fact that the detective, in the broadest sense, is unique in that they can cross societal boundaries.
Yeah.
They can speak to the drug dealer in the rundown scheme, and they can speak to the local aristocrat. And it seems, apart from police, the priest, the minister, the vicar, is perfectly placed. And you do that extremely well in this book, that you've got people who are really at the bottom end of the social scale, and you've got the people who've lived there since the 13th century.
Yeah.
So was that deliberate to think, okay, I can move this piece around the board and it can go anywhere it likes?
I think so. I mean, that's obviously, and it is a feature of I remember once when I was in Findon in the morning, I was seeing a parishioner who's serving a life sentence for a particularly unpleasant crime in the morning. And then in the evening, I had dinner with Prince Edward. And it was, both in the line of duty, if you see what I mean. And so you have this passe-partout, and that's interesting. So you can pass through the various strata of our world. I think also there's this interesting thing. People are sometimes rude about bishops and say, what can bishops living in their palaces in this exalted way know of the reality of life on the ground? Well, of course, bishops live in flats over the shop now. It's not grand. But actually, through the parish system, they're connected. They're only a phone call away from someone who is on the ground in every, I'm talking about England in particular, it's different in Scotland, I know, but in England, in every community. So actually, we tend to be pretty well informed about what's going on. And that ability to move between different social worlds enables us, I think, to see the connections that otherwise might not be seen.
I'd like to talk a bit about Daniel Clement himself in the book. I'm always interested in the names of characters. Daniel, obviously, is one of the 4 major prophets, and the name means God is judge. Clement introduces the idea of clemency, of a certain kind of restraint of judgment. Was the name deliberate? Was this nominative determinism, or was it just, that seems like a good name?
Well, I thought it was so obvious, but actually you're the first person who's noticed it, actually. Yes, I wanted someone in whom judgment and mercy were present, yeah.
And it is a book in which, compared to hard-boiled crime, for example, One thing that you're concerned with is understanding the why of the crime and not just the who did the crime.
Yeah.
And there's an element in the book, and it's a topic that I have been fascinated by for years now, about forgiveness.
Yeah.
About if you understand everything, can you then forgive everything? Can you just extrapolate a bit on that?
Well, again, this is the fruit of pastoral ministry. I've done quite a lot of prison ministry, and I've worked quite a lot with people who have been, well, there's one particular unit I worked in with inmates who were coming to the end of long sentences for the sorts of crimes that attract those sentences. And they were coming to the end of those sentences, and they were going on day release into town to work in a housing charity that we were part of, to prepare them for release into mainstream. Well, these were people who had been locked up before cash point machines or anything like that, so, trying to get them ready for the world outside prison. And of course, you get to know them quite well, and often inmates will talk to padres in a way that they might not talk to other officials because of that relationship of trust. And often, what they would tell you was not what they had inflicted. Some would talk about the suffering they'd inflicted, most wouldn't, but they would talk about the suffering that had been inflicted on them. Almost without exception, they had grown up in the care system. And almost without exception, as children, they'd been brutalized and abused physically, sexually sometimes. And guess what? That does not, when they become, I remember one guy telling me that he was sexually abused as a child in the care system, horribly. And he said that what messed his life up was being forced into an adult world when he was a child without having an adult's understanding or power. And that, he thinks, was what made him, having suffered the offences, become a perpetrator of those offences, someone with rare insight into the offending. Now, often with those kind of offences, it's not difficult to respond to that with unalloyed condemnation. The crime is egregious. The suffering it causes is appalling and unforgivable for many, perhaps. But at what point do you begin to hold that together with the knowledge that the person who perpetrated those offences was once the victim of those offences too? And once you start thinking about that, it tends to make you a bit more circumspect, I think. And that's what I would say. I'm not saying that you don't, those offences don't matter. I'm not saying you give people a pass, not at all. It must be accounted for. It must be known and reckoned and accounted for. But I think it behoves us to remember that people who inflict that kind of suffering might well have been the victims themselves once.
Do you think there is an unforgivable sin?
Well, I think there are sins which we can't forgive, but God can. Thank God.
In terms of the actual mechanics and clockwork of the book,
Yeah.
when you started writing it, did you always know who was going to be the perpetrator? Because you're very subtle at setting up various ways in which the novel could go, various things which might be the motivation.
Yes.
Until we get to the end.
Yes.
Did you always have that planned, or did you, as you were writing it, think, we could go in this direction?
No, I always knew who that was going to be. And I also knew who might be contenders for that post, if I could put it that way. Here's the thing. Writing fiction is not the same as reading fiction. And I've loved crime novels all my life. And the first proper book I ever got, my grandfather gave it to me when I was 7, was the Sherlock Holmes short stories. And I was utterly captivated by this mysterious figure, almost sinister figure, who lived on the edge of things, wasn't quite part of anything, whose connections to people were difficult. But he had this ability to see and to concentrate and to work things out. So I was sort of fascinated by that. So I knew that I wanted that person to be in it. But I also, they're complicated things, parishes. And sometimes I was berated by someone who thought that crime fiction that was set in vicarages and country villages in 1988, as mine is, was sort of escapist fiction and didn't deal with the reality of life. And I said, well, actually, that is the reality of my life. I don't live in the mean streets of the inner city where you might prefer your fiction to be set. But this is not unreality. This is actually reality. And, you know, the most cursory read of English literature tells you that, to reverse the saying of Philip Larkins, something can happen anywhere. When I went to find, I was in central London before, a sort of posh parish, Knightsbridge, and then I went to be a country parson in Northamptonshire, Diocese of Peterborough. And I remember a friend of mine who was a very glamorous priest. That's the Portugal. He thought I was going to be vicar of the Grosvenor Chapel, Mayfair. And he said to me, "Oh, I hear you're going to Mayfair." And I went, "No." He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Findham in the Diocese of Peterborough." And he said, "What did the bishop catch you doing?" And people thought that it would be, you know, Splat the Rat and school assemblies and the panto, and indeed it was all those things. We had a murder in my first week because something happens anywhere. Jane Austen, you know, you don't have to read very widely in English literature to see something happening anywhere.
It reminds me of a friend of mine who was, for a while, in monastic orders, saying that the idea that becoming a monk was a retreat from the world is absolutely wrong. It's actually bringing you straight close to the world, and you have to get on with the people around you, and you might not like them. And I think that's one of the things that comes across very strongly in the book, is you do have to deal with people that sometimes you could be, you know, see them far enough.
Yeah. I mean, you can't like them, but you do have to love them. And that is indeed a real challenge. Book 3 is set in a monastery, by the way.
Oh, excellent. So is book 3 already written?
No, book 2 is written. Book 3 is, I'm just finishing book 2 at the moment.
Well, I mean, it does fascinate me that we do have an obligation to love, but it can be terribly, terribly difficult to like.
Yes, of course.
And the way in which the book begins, when I read the first couple of pages, I was just immediately entranced by it, because it begins with a problem about taking out pews in the church. And it sounds as if that's sort of whimsical and minor and all the rest of it. I've been in the meetings where we took the pews out from our church, and I genuinely thought somebody could get murdered by the end of it. Yeah. One person said to me, extremely angry, said, "No daughter of mine will ever get married in this church if you take the pews out."
Yeah, because it's
but
not
those
about...
small things are so crucial within...
Because it's... I mean, so my story begins with the vicar standing up in church on Sunday and announcing, thinking this is going to be to the delight of everyone, that they're going to install a new lavatory. Everyone goes mad. And the whole thing began when one day I stood up in my church on a Sunday and announced we're going to install a new lavatory. And everybody went mad, and I thought, but this is so obviously a good idea. Why? Well, because it would involve moving some pews, and because that wasn't just moving pews, it was moving people and their lives and their attachments. And one of the things, and this is a very common thing in the Church of England, is that the kind of people who the vicar talks to on the standing committee, who have ideas about reordering a church and changing things and making it fit for purpose, which are all important and necessary things, are the kind of people whose lives have been the kind of lives where you do that. Often who that impacts on are people who maybe don't have very much, and in some cases don't have anything, but what they do have is a place in church, and it's really important to them. So don't mess, you know, or understand what's at stake.
It is very, very difficult, and it's something that the church here is going through as well. Yeah. As part of my life in the church, I did have to go around various churches and see whether or not they actually had a toilet.
Yeah.
And actually, leading worship at one place, the session clerk phoned me and said, "Make sure you go before you come to us, because we've now got a toilet." And so what happens if there's any sort of emergency? They say, "Second gravestone in the back there."
Well, there was the northeast buttress on the transept was where the vicar could relieve himself if necessary, because you couldn't be seen because we had the shed with the lawnmower obscured the view if you ever got caught short. But of course, it's a very interesting thing. What do people expect of churches? Well, ours was altered because we needed to make it more of a performance space, so we could get musicians in and orchestras in and do all the things that you need to do, partly to earn the money to keep a medieval building going, which is not cheap, partly also to continue to have a relationship with the wider community. But that can sometimes, I mean, the biggest resistance to the lavatory we were going to install in our church, and we already have one, but there was another one, was somebody thought that she couldn't bear the thought of the sound of something flushing during divine service. Couldn't bear it. And, well, what's that about? Well, there's someone who is deeply devoted to some place that is sacred and holy, and she doesn't want that defiled or profaned in any way. The fact is that we defile and profane it not with what we flush away, but with what we speak normally. Was another conversation to have. But people, it's another thing, it's this hidden world that churches perch on top on. So people come to church and they're not, lots of people, you see it, I know in Edinburgh in the festival, lots of people going into, people wandering around, tourists, no religious connection, no religious commitment in their lives, but they go into a church and they look around and, that's interesting. Because there is this sense that they are places of distinction, important.
And of sanctuary.
And places that acknowledge what we all know to be profoundly true. Where, our origins, where we're going, what is the point of our existence, what was here before we were, what will be here after we've gone. That's the stuff we do. And even if our doctrine has become completely gobbledygook, and our, helter-skelters in cathedrals, that's a big thing in England at the moment, that's annoying everybody too. But it annoys them because there is still this sense that they are, Philip Larkin again, a sacred house on sacred earth it is.
Yes, I mean, it still has a patina of quietude in some ways, in both
we had an issue.
Quietus as death and quiet as silence.
We had a parishioner who was a very unhappy and disturbed young man. And one of the ways his unhappiness and disturbance played out was by vandalizing the church. There are lots of other places he could have vandalized, but he picked the church. I knew who it was, and we had a relationship in the end and moved things on. But it was, why the church? Because the church especially disappointed him, because it stood for values that had failed in his life, I think.
One thing that I found extremely touching in the book is you do have a same-sex relationship. And it's the one point in the book where Daniel has to really interrogate his own conscience and his own misjudgment.
Yes.
In that the relationship is between people from quite disparate social backgrounds, and his presumption is that this must be predatory lust.
Yes.
And I don't think it's a spoiler to say it's actually about love.
Yeah.
And what was very interesting is that you actually had a character, your central character, whom we are supposed to empathize with, realizing, I have made a terrible misjudgment here.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about that? Because it is something which obviously the church has been dealing with or not dealing with for decades.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's still something that if you are an LGBT person, as we would say an LGBT plus person now, or a gay person in my case, you're still sometimes surprised at how that is not something that others in the church imagine as being just a variation on the universal theme of identity, sexuality, romance, whatever it might be, but still see it as something that's a sort of a problem. And I can remember once, I had a colleague who was an American chap, and a very nice guy, very conservative, evangelical, but always very sort of keen, not great around equal marriage. Well, I say not great, didn't agree with me. But we always got on perfectly well. And we'd had a deanery evensong. And the next day he phoned me and went, "Hi, Richard." And I said, "Hi." And he goes, "I just wanted to apologize." And I said, "What for?" And he said, "What I said last night, I just wasn't thinking. You must have been so offended and so hurt. I'm really sorry." And I said, "What did you say?" He said, when I told that guy to bugger off." And he said, "I hope you weren't offended." And I said, "Well, not until now." But I think it has been the case in the church that we have often missed what is good and gracious and holy in people's lives because we haven't understood it. It's not just about sexuality. One of the most powerful experiences, learning experiences I had when I was first ordained was I had to go and do a funeral in Boston, in Lincolnshire, where I was curate, my first curacy. And it was in a very rough part of town, worst street in the worst part of town. And when I got there, the house was all beaten up and awful. And the woman who'd lived there had lived on a bed with a commode next to the bed, and a son who had learning difficulties who slept on a sort of cot next to her. And the house was really semi-derelict. And the floor was sticky, and it was pretty awful. And I spoke to this boy. The boy was a man, and he had very little to say. So I was sort of thinking, okay, we'll do this. So I did a, bog standard job for a cremation funeral. Didn't really think about it very much. And when I arrived at the crematorium, there were 250 people there. And I thought, who are these people for? And it turned out to be for her. So I did, I'm ashamed to say, a rather perfunctory job that day. I should have done better, but I did what I did. And at the end, there was a guy, I remember him particularly because he was mixed race, but he was wearing the uniform of a British Army officer. So I said to him, what's your connection to her? And he said, turned out this woman had been the caregiver on that estate. She'd taken in all the lost kids, and there were plenty of those, many of them without any kind of stability in their homes, if they even had a home at all. She'd looked after them, she'd kind of wiped their noses and put bandages on their cuts, and just taken care of them in a very rough and ready sort of way. She wasn't sentimental, she wasn't sweet, she was tough, but she just did that. She was a caregiver. And I said, why did it make such an impression on you? And he said, until I knew her, I had never thought for a moment that life could ever be any better than what it is now. I never even thought of the future, he said, because there was no future worth thinking of. So, don't judge books by covers, right?
It's possibly the most difficult thing that Christianity has to teach us, is that sense of judgmentalism and how to catch oneself before going into it. I mean, one part of the book right at the beginning that I have to say I felt a twinge of guilt about is when they're talking about the flower show. He sometimes thought that they started to think of the church primarily as a sort of giant flower pot, the font a convenient oasis. And there's been times I know myself that I've been peeved, thinking, you just care about the flowers. And you think, but actually it means something to them. And if it means something to them, then it means something.
Yeah.
And you cannot, think, well, these are the things that I do, and they're more important. I mean, there's no hierarchy that way.
No. Clergy are really bad at that, of course. We think it's our show. And it's not our show, actually. It's God's show. And our job is to be facilitators of that, But I think sometimes we arrogate to ourselves more than we deserve. And you learn stuff in a parish. I mean, I grew up in a version of the church in which Father knows best, a sort of traditional Anglo-Catholic background. Father knows best. And I'd always exercised a ministry that way. Nothing happened without my knowledge or sign off. And then I found I just couldn't do it anymore. I just couldn't manage all the things that needed managing in a parish. And then I realized that there are other people around me who can do it better than I can. And my great discovery was just giving that stuff up. Let other people who are good at it do it. And then I learned a lot about my own deficiencies. The thing about Christianity is we are imperfect people called to the perfection of Christ. So failure is a hallmark of authentic discipleship. So don't worry about that.
It's Simon Critchley's argument that he puts forward in his book that, Christianity, everyone's going to fail at this.
Yes.
The bar is too high.
And more than that.
But that makes you humble.
But everything, you have the range of your competence and your aptitude. Hurrah. Not that far. Everything interesting in faith happens once you reach the far limit of your own competence, because that's when it's not about you. That's when you discover what it's about, which is that our job is to serve, to be the hands, the feet, the words, the deeds of Jesus Christ.
I can't wait for the next one, particularly because you set up rather, and again, this isn't really a spoiler because the book is still to come, you set up the fact that the parishes are going to have to start combining, and there'll be unions and linkages. And that is always a kind of semi-nuclear option within churches.
Semi?
Semi. We're going through that a lot within the Church of Scotland at the moment.
Yeah.
The famous, possibly apocryphal story is of a parish on the shore and one that was inland, and when they said, we're going to have to unite your two parishes, the ones inland said they didn't even tell us when the Vikings were coming. But the serious point is that different churches have evolved into different forms and with their own traditions and tastes.
Yeah.
Now, I was at the assembly this year. I voted in favour of solemnisation of same-sex relationships. But I know there's parishes where two parts are going to be united and one part is very against solemnisation of same-sex relationships and one is content to see it with the proviso that it's the conscience of the minister.
Yeah.
It really is going to be extremely difficult to sort of yoke these things together.
Yeah.
Is there a way that we can actually begin some kind of dialogue about this?
Well, I mean, this is the debate that's been affecting not only the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, but the Church of England and indeed the Episcopalian Church in Scotland too. And we're all at various stages along the way with that, some more progressive, some more conservative. We've just had this extraordinary meeting of the Anglican bishops around the world at the Lambeth Conference in London, which got off to in Canterbury, which got off to a terribly bad start by the suggestion that what they were going to restate was an absolute prohibition on the equality of gay relationships. And then actually, by the end of the conference, they'd worked out a way of working on a framework in which those, I mean, basically it's, if you want, that Anglican polity is broad enough to include both, and that we're going to find a way of continuing to walk together insofar as we can, however impaired our opportunities to be together may be, but to do it together rather than to fall apart. If that works or not, I don't know. But it seems to me that's not a bad thing to model, actually. And if, I'm talking about the Church of England in particular, which is one somebody once described as a personality disorder, rather than ecclesiology, and that we try to, you know, the Church of England is crucified between a Puritan and a Papist, it was said in the time of Richard Hooker. And we are this weird hybrid, this attempt to hold together irreconcilable views. And of course that's incredibly demanding and frustrating sometimes, and impossible. But it seems to me to model something that could be quite powerful in a very centrifugal age such as ours. One of the things I think church can do now is model what it is like to hold to territory on which we can all stand regardless of our ideological commitments. In Scotland, I've got lots of Scottish friends. I've been coming here for many years. I spend every spring in Scotland too. And of my Scottish friends, since 2014, some are no longer speaking to others for the obvious reason. And that is a very painful reality. So if you can find ways of continuing to hold that there is common land on which we can stand, which transcends all other commitments, that might be powerful.
I couldn't agree more. We have some questions coming in, and I'll take some questions from the audience. We have 15 minutes. If we don't get around to everybody, and I'm sure there's going to be quite a lot of questions, you can speak to Richard when you come and buy a copy of the book and get it signed. I'm sure he's very happy to speak to you then, but we can take a question immediately in the hall, or I can just go straight to the... there's somebody just here.
This is more of a recommendation. You've written all sorts of things, Richard, and you talked about how in crime fiction, vicars are usually good. Could I encourage you to write an episode of Midsummer Murders, which is full of vicars, and they're nearly always very bad. Most of them are murderers and all the rest are adulterers. Could you do that, please?
How like my own deanery synod. That's a very useful recommendation, thank you. I should say we have sold the television rights for Canon Clement, so hopefully it'll be coming to a small screen near you before too long.
Any choice about who should play Daniel?
I have someone in mind, but I daren't say lest I jinx it.
We'll take another in the audience, just at the front here. And then if we go right to the back, because you've got to get your steps in.
Richard, I think it's safe to say that you've had quite an amazing life, sort of pop star, Strictly, etc., radio star, clearly an excellent author. Where are you going to be in 10 years, and what remains on your bucket list?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Well, I've just moved, so I moved in May to the house which I have vowed I will only leave horizontally. So it was my last ever move, and that was great. So I hope I will be in East Sussex in 10 years' time, should God grant me another 10 years. And I've moved there to retire. A friend of mine lives there, and she's also retired too, and some other friends of mine live there. And we've all sort of retired to the same place. And we were talking when we were all got together about what is it we wanted to do. And they said, well, what do you want to do? And I thought, I want to walk around looking at things. So I'm going to sign up for classes with a local natural history group, and I'm going to walk around looking at things, because I'd love to know a little bit more about the natural world. I'd love to know a bit more about flowers and trees and fauna and flora, and walk along Eastbourne Beach, although I don't recommend walking along the beaches of East Sussex at the moment. But I don't, so the bucket list thing, I'd quite like to learn to yodel. I've always wanted to yodel. It's not a common thing, but I've always wanted to yodel. But unfortunately, East Sussex College doesn't offer yodeling classes at the moment, but maybe Swiss House in London will be able to help. But nothing, really.
I'll just take one from the online viewers. Christine C. I find it quite bizarre when it's just the initial of the surname. Christine C. is asking, how did you decide on your characters? For example, are they based on your parishioners or your loved ones?
Well, no,
enemies,
it's the short answer. I mean, people always say that, people say, oh, is Daniel you? And it's not me at all. He's much, much more diligent than me. He's much more buttoned up than me, actually, although more to come on that. We do share a strange obsession with stationery.
Which is lovely in the book.
I just can't walk past the Ryman's. I just can't. So that's one thing we have in common. But no, I didn't put parishioners into it because parishioners are not tokens for my narrative purposes. So even if you thought about doing it, it would involve, I think, a sort of betrayal, actually, of a relationship that wouldn't be good. There is, Daniel's mother, Audrey, is the only person who's really based on a real person, and that is my mother. So Daniel's mother is pretty much my mother.
In terms of that, though, the cooking is very good in this book.
Well, my mother is a great cook. Well, she's not well enough now to cook, but she was a great cook. And one of the ways she exercised her formidable powers was controlling us through food. My father and we're all foodies, and that was partly because my mother's way of getting us to do what she wanted. Can I tell you a great story about my mother? Sorry, but she now has dementia and she can't walk or stand, so she's cared for at home. It's been going on for a few years now. And when lockdown happened, of course I couldn't get to see her, but I would go and stand in her garden and wave to her through French windows just to make sure she was okay. You know, her life is quite tough, really. But anyway, I went round one day, right in the first lockdown, and there she was, sitting in her chair, sort of sleeping. So I banged on the window and went, Mum, Mum. No response. So I went, Mum, it's me, just give us no response. And I had that dread that anyone has who's looking after an older person. Oh, my God. So I banged on the window and went, Mum, are you okay? And she went, fooled you.
There was somebody right at the back.
Thanks. I absolutely loved the book. It's brilliant.
Thank you.
My question is a doggy question. Why did you choose Dachshunds, part one? And part two, the one thing I found a bit disturbing was when the Dachshunds had to get quite intimate in the contamination of the crime scene. And
yes.
I wondered why you did that, because that was almost a bit upsetting.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry you were upset, but actually I did kind of mean people to be upset. Dachshunds, because I have Dachshunds, and I always have had since I was a boy. And so I spent a lot of time looking at them. And the interesting about a Dachshund is that they don't know that they are cute and pretty, and everybody goes, oh, around them, which we do, because they're bred now to look cute, you know, this nice shape, and they've got lovely coats. But they're hunting dogs, as you know. They were bred originally to hunt badgers, and it was dwarfism was bred into lurchers, actually, was how it began, to make them long and low so they could go down badger sets and get badgers. So what interests me is that we think dachshunds are these cute little dogs, but actually they're quite fierce animals. And I like the idea of Daniel, who is very punctilious and always very measured and very careful and very thoughtful about what he does. He's limited by that. And one of the interesting things in the relationship with his mother, more of this in book 2, is she's not constrained by those things, and she gets frustrated with his diplomatic nature. Dogs aren't diplomatic at all. And one of the things I quite enjoy doing in the book is contrasting Daniel's diffidence with the dog's absolute commitment to the moment. And so I wanted them to discover the body in this case. I don't want to give too much away. In the next book, they do something even more significant. I hope less upsetting. But I'm just saying, it came about because I was looking at the Queen on television and thinking, why does the Queen surround herself with dogs? And after a while, I began to think it's because they're not deferential. Because dogs give you their dog affection, regardless of who you are. They don't know that she's the Queen, they're unaware of her status, they don't bow and curtsy. And I think that's maybe it. Maybe we need that dogs restore to us perhaps groundedness in the world that we might lose to a role. So that's why.
I remember as a teenager reading Goethe's Faust, when Mephistopheles appears as a poodle, and not knowing that, of course, in the 18th century, poodles were hunting dogs.
Yeah.
I was thinking, that seems a bit unlikely. Some cute little poodle is the devil. You know?
But actually, I've known some very cute toy-like creatures who were quite devilish when I think about it.
Another question from online. Jane is saying how much she enjoyed your programme on good grief on Channel 4.
Thank you.
And it says, laughter yoga. Could you extrapolate a bit about that? Which of the options did you find most helpful in this regard?
So for those who don't know, I made a documentary about bereavement recently based on the book I wrote about bereavement. And it was one of the things I did was I went to look at the various therapies that are offered to people who are coping with bereavement. And one of them was laughter yoga. Has anyone ever done laughter yoga? Oh, someone has. Well, basically, you make yourself laugh using sort of physical techniques. And the idea is that once you make yourself laugh, the physical benefits of laughter, you'll get them. You fake it till you make it, if you see what I mean. And so often people who are bereaved, they do this thing when they stand in a circle, they make themselves laugh, and that promotes feelings of well-being. It didn't really work for me, and I'll tell you why. Because as a vicar and as a Radio 4 presenter, I have to pretend to enjoy myself so much anyway. I'm not going to do it off duty, if you see what I mean. But I also did indoor skydiving with a double amputee former paratrooper in Milton Keynes. That was good fun. I did surfing. That wasn't, right, I enjoyed it, but it wasn't really for me. I did alpaca therapy, where I got close up with some alpacas. Nice to meet a creature with breath less fragrant than my own. The one I liked most of all was boxing. So I went to have some boxing lessons with a boxing coach. And to my surprise, I enjoyed that very much, yeah. And I think if you are bereaved, often part of it is physical. You feel literally weighed down. You feel literally burdened, heavier, slower, climbing a hill all the time. And to do physical things that I remember when I was surfing, just the feeling of the wave catching your board and all of a sudden you're lifted up was really powerful, actually. So those were various. The best thing, though, was Other Widows, was the solidarity of other women. And the day David died, he died early in the morning, and I went to buy hand cream for the nurses in ICU, because actually what nurses really want is not chocolates and flowers, it's hand cream. So I went to L'Occitane, which was the posh hand cream place near me, to splurge. And it had been on the news, David's death, and a lady came up to me, and she said, "I'm so sorry to hear about your partner." And I sort of lost it a little bit. And she took my hand, and she said, "I'm a widow too, I understand." And I said, oh, thank you. And I said, what do I need to know? And she thought for a minute, and then she said, no one will ever be as nice to you again as they are now, so make the most of it.
That solidarity of grief is something quite staggering where I live in the Scottish borders.
Yeah.
We have a coffee morning in the church each week. And at one point I realized that there's always 8 chairs round the table. 4 of the women, including my mother, had lost a child.
Really?
And somehow they could speak about that in that space in a way they would never have kind of met each other separately and discussed that.
Where do you go? Where do you take that stuff? Churches, because it recognizes the importance of those events and feelings and what it does to people. Another reason I wrote the book was I was fascinated in, because of my age and where I am, I've been at the deathbeds of a lot of people who were the last to see active service in war, or when the Second World War. And it was revelatory. So I would, I'm talking about the old boys who you would see when I was a kid. You'd see them at the Bowls Club with their blazers and their Daily Express and their little Jack Russell. And I wouldn't really give them credit at all, if I even noticed them at all. And then when I got to know them better, and I discovered that they'd been at Monte Cassino, or in Burma, or on the North Atlantic convoys, and had seen terrible things, and sometimes had done terrible things 40 years before. And lots of them wanted to leave it behind, didn't talk about it, didn't share it with their families. On their deathbeds, often they would talk about it, because guess what? You can't leave that stuff behind. It comes with you. And I was just interested in the long-term effects of that, what it does to people. Why, there's photographs of the British Legion. We had our British Legion centenary. It was the last thing I did before I retired, was take the centenary service for our Royal British Legion. And there's these guys, and it's 1922, and it's the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. And they're there in their Homburgs and their, check suits and their fob chains and their chests full of medals, respectable, upstanding citizens, fathers, sons, grandfathers. But they had all been through Passchendaele, the Somme, Ypres. What did it do to you?
We're just about out of time, so if you did have a question, please come to the signing tent where Richard will be afterwards. I'll just end with one question, and you can make the answer as brief as you like. Will there still be a church in 10 years' time, 20 years' time?
There will be a church in 10 to 20 years' time. I'm not sure what it will look like, but there's no rebirth without death. We know this. And I don't want to pretend it isn't going to be tough, because death always is. But it is not the end of the story.
I wish we'd had 2 hours or 3 hours. It has been an absolute privilege and delight to speak to you again. I'm sure the audience will want to join me in thanking the Reverend Richard Coles.
Thank you, Stuart.